The Bride Who Wasn't. The wind across the Wyoming plains carried dust and memory, scattering both over the wide silence of Ethan Cole's ranch. The place had learned to live without laughter. Horses grazed under a dull sky. Fences leaned tiredly toward the horizon, and the house, once warmed by another woman's voice, had become a museum of absence. That morning, Ethan received a letter stamp from an international agency. The envelope was clean, foreign, too white against his weathered hands. He opened it at the kitchen table, beside an untouched cup of coffee. Inside, words promised a new beginning, written in a tone so businesslike it bordered on cruel. Your requested partner will arrive on the 14th. Prepare documentation and identification upon collection. He had not ordered a partner so much as he had surrendered to one. Friends called it loneliness. He called it practicality. He told himself love was a young man's luxury. What he needed was help, conversation, maybe a heartbeat other than his own echoing through the house. By afternoon, a gray van stopped at his gate. The driver spoke little English, handing over a clipboard before motioning toward the passenger seat. A woman stepped out, slight, quiet, holding a single brown suitcase and an envelope pressed to her chest. Her hair was tied back, her clothes plain, her eyes lowered. She spoke first, her accent soft but steady. Not the beautiful bride you ordered. Ethan blinked, half expecting a punchline. The translator who arranged this hadn't mentioned any confusion. He managed a small, unsure grin. You're all, he said, the words escaping like a reflex, something between kindness and disbelief. She smiled, barely, and bowed her head. My name is Li Xinyi. They shook hands. Her palm was cold. Inside the house, silence grew like ivy. Ethan showed her the rooms, the kitchen, the porch, the small bedroom he'd cleared of Martha's belongings. Lien paused at the doorframe, fingers brushing the carved initials still burned into the wood. E+M. She said nothing, but her silence was heavy with questions. That evening, they shared a meal of beans and cornbread. Ethan ate in the pattern of habit. Lien, in deliberate quietness, as though memorizing each motion. She looked around as if the walls themselves might reveal how to belong. He spoke first, breaking the hum of the refrigerator. There was a mistake, you said? Yes. Her hands rested neatly beside her plate. Agency sent wrong file. Another woman was promised to you. I was replacement. He leaned back, absorbing it like a farmer watching rain ruin a harvest. You didn't have to come. Her answer was soft but certain. I want to start again. Anywhere. That settled it. They didn't talk more. Days folded quietly. Lien cleaned, cooked, and learned the rhythm of the ranch. She rose before dawn, whispering to the chickens in Mandarin, her voice threading through the fog. Ethan worked in the fields, sometimes watching her from the barn window. She moved carefully, as though afraid to disturb the ground itself. At night, she wrote letters at the kitchen table, sealing them neatly but never mailing them. Once, Ethan caught a glimpse of a line in her notebook. He speaks little, but his silence listens. He pretended not to notice. By the third week, the house began to feel less like an echo chamber and more like a place where time breathed again. The air smelled of soap and simmering rice instead of dust and coffee. Yet something fragile hummed between them, a recognition neither could name. One evening, while fixing a broken fence, Ethan found Lien standing beside the paddock, watching the sunset glaze the fields in gold. She spoke without turning. Your wife, she loved this land. He hesitated, hammer in hand. She was this land. Lien nodded. Then you still live with her. He said nothing, but the words clung to him long after. That night, he couldn't sleep. He found himself standing by the window, watching her shadow move across the kitchen as she poured water into a kettle. Her silhouette, faceless in the low light, seemed both foreign and familiar, like a language he'd once known but forgotten how to speak. The next morning, Lien placed a bowl of congee before him. You worked too long, she said. He almost told her she didn't need to care, but something in her tone made him stop. He nodded instead, quietly grateful. Later, while she hung laundry in the wind, he noticed a strand of thread caught on the fence, fluttering like a small white flag. He reached for it, unsure why it made his chest tighten. That evening, he repaired the radio in the living room. Music filled the house again for the first time in years, soft, hesitant like both of them. She listened from the doorway, smiling faintly. "You fix more than fences," she said. Ethan looked up. "Sometimes things just need a reason to work again." Her eyes met his for the briefest second. In that stillness, something unspoken passed between them. A promise or a warning, neither could tell. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain. Inside, the air felt less empty. For the first time since Martha's death, Ethan forgot to close the door before sleeping. And Lien, from her room across the hall, listened to the rain on the roof and wondered how long before she'd forget that she was only a replacement bride. The story of what neither of them ordered had just begun. What grows between? Spring came quietly to the plains, softening the land that had been frozen in silence. The ranch breathed again, horses restless in their stalls, the air smelling faintly of wet hay and sunlight. Ethan found himself waking earlier, not out of duty, but from an unfamiliar sense of expectation. Somewhere in the kitchen, Li Xinyi would already be moving, boiling tea, feeding chickens, humming songs without words. They had learned to share the same air without speaking much. Words, when they came, were careful, balanced like cups of water between them. Yet something invisible had started to form. A space both fragile and magnetic, built from glances, gestures, and the comfort of quiet company. One morning, as they repaired the barn roof together, Lien paused mid-step. "In China, my father fixed everything with bamboo," she said, adjusting a wooden beam. "He said strength hides in flexibility." Ethan nodded, hammering a nail. "Sounds like he knew ranching." She smiled faintly. "No, he sold shoes." He laughed, the sound startling both of them. She looked down at him, the corner of her mouth trembling in amusement, and for the first time, laughter did not feel like betrayal. Later, over lunch, she found a box of photographs tucked beneath the table. Ethan froze as she lifted one. Martha, his late wife, standing in the field, sunlight in her hair. Lien's fingers brushed the image gently, her expression unreadable. "She was beautiful," Lien said softly. "She was everything," Ethan replied. The words came out heavy, too honest. Lien placed the photograph back as though returning something sacred. "And now, she is the silence you still speak to." He didn't deny it. There was no point. In the following weeks, Lien began keeping a small notebook near her plate. She said it helped her learn English, but Ethan suspected it was her way of learning him. He often caught her writing phrases he'd said. "The land remembers, don't rush the rain, quiet can be kind." Once, he saw his own name written beside the word steady. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled over the plains. They hurried to bring the horses inside. Rain lashed against the barn, thunder shaking the rafters. In the half-light, Ethan reached to steady her as she stumbled on the wet floor. For breath, her hands rested on his chest. Their eyes met, an instant long enough to know it was dangerous. Neither moved away. The moment passed only when lightning cracked close by, sending both of them scrambling to close the doors. Yet the warmth of her touch lingered long after. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the radio he'd fixed. He wanted to turn it on, but he feared what the sound might awaken. Instead, he found one of her letters lying open, a draft never sent. "He carries his grief like a coat he cannot take off," it read, "and I keep reaching for the buttons." He folded the page, his chest tight, with something that was not guilt but recognition. Days blurred into a rhythm of shared labor and unspoken understanding. They repaired fences, cooked in silence, and sometimes shared a cup of tea under the porch. Lien began to laugh more easily. Ethan began to listen more deeply. He noticed her habits, the way she always paused before speaking, how she traced circles on the table when thinking. She noticed his too, the way he lingered near the barn at dusk, or how his eyes softened when he said her name. Will Hayes, Ethan's old friend and ranch hand, began to notice as well. "You're different lately," he said one evening, tossing a bale of hay into the truck. "Smiling like you forgot what winter felt like." Ethan shrugged. Maybe it's just spring. Well, squinted, then muttered, "Careful, Ethan. Something's thawed too fast." Ethan said nothing, but the warning clung to him like dust on boots. That night, Lien brought tea to his porch. They sat side by side, the stars bright enough to touch. "Do you ever think of going back?" he asked quietly. "Back," she repeated. "There is nothing there to return to." He turned toward her. "Then what brought you here?" "Not love," she said. "Not escape. Just a hope that someone might see me before I disappear." The honesty of it hit him harder than he expected. He wanted to tell her that he saw her, that he had from the moment she stepped off that van, but the words stayed lodged in his throat. Instead, he said, "You're seen." She looked at him then, eyes shining faintly in the dark. "By whom?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them filled with everything they couldn't say. The porch light flickered once before going out, plunging them into darkness. Neither moved to fix it. When she rose to leave, she hesitated by the door. "Good night, Ethan." Her voice trembled slightly on his name. "Good night, Lien." After she disappeared down the hallway, he sat for a long time, listening to the echo of his heartbeat in the stillness. He knew, with a strange and certain dread, that something irreparable had begun, not with a touch, but with the wanting of one. Outside, the rain returned, soft and forgiving. Inside, the distance between them had become too close to name. The storm that knows. The sky darkened without warning that afternoon, swallowing the horizon in a single sweep of gray. Ethan felt the pressure drop, the kind of air that makes animals restless and people honest. He was mending the north fence when he saw Lien running toward him, dress whipping in the wind. Her voice barely reached him over the rising storm. "The horses," she shouted. "They're panicking." By the time they reached the stables, the wind had grown wild, tearing shingles from the roof. Rain burst open across the fields, thick and relentless. Inside the barn, the smell of wet hay and fear filled the air. Together they wrestled the gates closed, hands brushing, breath mingling in the heat of struggle. When the last horse was safe, Ethan pulled the door shut. The world beyond vanished into a blur of thunder and rain. Inside, only the low hum of storm and their uneven breathing remained. Lien leaned against a beam, soaked through. Strands of hair clung to her neck, and her hands trembled from exhaustion. Ethan reached for a towel from the hook, wordless, and offered it. She took it without meeting his eyes. "Every storm here feels bigger than the last," she murmured, wringing water from her sleeves. "They aren't," he said quietly. "You just start noticing more once you've got something to lose." She froze, her hands stilling mid-motion. "And what do you have to lose, Ethan?" He hesitated. The wind howled through the cracks, filling the space where a lie could have fit. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe what I shouldn't want." The air thickened between them. Lightning flickered through a gap in the boards, washing her face in pale gold. She looked fragile and defiant all at once. "I was never meant for you," she said, voice barely audible. "You ordered another woman. I was a mistake." Ethan stepped closer, the words pulled out of him like confession. Maybe mistakes are the only real things left. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The barn creaked under the wind. Lien's eyes glistened, not from rain, but from the weight of what was forming, something too powerful for reason, too dangerous for forgiveness. He reached up, almost touching her cheek, but stopped. The restraint hurt more than surrender. She looked at him, trembling, and whispered, "If we cross this, we can't go back." "We haven't even gone anywhere," he replied, his voice rough. But both knew that wasn't true. They had already gone too far in silence, in glances, in every unsent letter and unfinished word. Outside, thunder cracked like judgment. She stepped back first, shaking her head as if trying to break a spell. "You're grieving your wife through me," she said. "That isn't love. It's not grief," Ethan said, almost pleading. "It's life. Coming back." Her expression softened, sad, knowing. "Then live, Ethan. But don't use me to remember how." She turned away, but before she reached the door, the latch rattled. It wouldn't budge. The storm had jammed it shut. They were trapped. Two people bound not by fate, but by timing. He sat on an overturned crate, hands buried in his hair. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he said quietly. "I know," she whispered. "Neither did I." The storm raged on. They waited in silence, the distance between them more painful than touch. When the thunder began to fade, Ethan spoke again, almost to himself. "I kept her picture out there," he said, nodding toward the old storage loft. "Couldn't bring myself to put it away. Thought it was loyalty. Maybe it was fear." Lien climbed the ladder slowly, her movements careful. From the shelf, she lifted the frame. Martha smiling in sunlight, eyes alive. Dust clung to the glass. She stared at it for a long moment, then descended and handed it to him. "You don't have to forget her," she said. "Just stop living in her shadow." Ethan took the frame. The glass cracked under his grip, not shattered, just a thin line down the center, dividing the image like time itself. Lien's breath caught, but she didn't move. Something in him broke open. "I can't fix this," he said. She shook her head gently. "Not everything asked to be fixed." The latch finally gave way with a metallic snap. The door swung open to the rain's fading rhythm. Lien stepped into the gray light, pausing only once. "I'll leave tomorrow," she said, voice steady. "Before the next storm comes." Ethan didn't stop her. When the rain ended, he stood alone, holding the cracked photograph. The horses were calm now, their breaths steady and rhythmic. He placed the picture back on the shelf, face down. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to look. From outside came the faint sound of her closing the guest room door, followed by the quietest sound of suitcase unzipping. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The roof dripped in slow intervals, like a clock marking endings. He thought of her words, "You're grieving your wife through me." He didn't know if she was right, but he knew she was leaving, and that knowledge hollowed him. When dawn came, he found her letter on the kitchen table, folded with precision. The handwriting was careful, small, unflinching. "I was never your bride, but I was your beginning." The words struck like truth. He read them again and again until the ink blurred. Outside, the horizon cleared. The storm had passed, but something deeper still churned inside him. Quiet, relentless, waiting to decide whether it was loss or grace. "You're all." The morning after the storm was mercilessly bright, as though the sky itself refused to remember what had happened beneath it. The field shimmered with rainwater. The air carried the scent of new grass and quiet finality. Ethan stood by the porch, watching Li Xinyi walk down the dirt path that led to the main road. Her suitcase was small, her steps deliberate. She didn't look back. He told himself not to call after her. Words, he had learned, could trap a person as tightly as fences. So he let her go in silence, his hands gripping the railing until the wood bit into his palms. By the time the horizon swallowed her shape, the ranch had already begun to reclaim its solitude. The wind moved through the grass again. The chickens clucked in familiar rhythm. But something essential had shifted. A space inside him had opened, one that even grief had never touched. He spent the day working without reason, repairing a gate that didn't need fixing, oiling hinges that already turned smoothly. When he entered the barn at dusk, the air still carried her scent, tea leaves and rain. On the shelf where he'd once kept Martha's photograph, there was only a folded piece of paper. He hesitated before opening it. "Do not be kind to me by forgetting. Be kind to yourself by living." The handwriting was hers, steady, measured, final. Ethan sat on the haystack, reading it until the ink sank into memory. Night fell. The ranch, once heavy with ghosts, felt oddly alive. He cooked himself dinner, though he barely tasted it. The clock ticked steadily. The silence no longer threatened to crush him. In the following weeks, time rearranged itself. The spring harvest came early. The horses grew restless, and the earth demanded attention. Ethan responded like a man relearning a language he'd once spoken fluently. The grief he carried no longer ruled him. It worked beside him, quiet, patient, almost gentle. Will Hayes visited one afternoon, leaning against the fence as Ethan tossed hay into the troughs. "Heard she left," Will said. "You doing all right?" Ethan didn't answer at first. He looked across the field, where sunlight scattered over the tall grass like broken glass. "I think so," he said finally. "Feels strange. Like something ended, but not badly." Will nodded, chewing on a piece of straw. "Sometimes that's the best kind of ending." Ethan gave a faint smile. "She taught me that." They worked side by side for a while, neither speaking much. The world had resumed its rhythm, though not quite as before. That evening, as the sun dipped low, a delivery truck rumbled down the lane. The driver handed Ethan a parcel wrapped in brown paper, postmarked from Guangzhou. Inside, he found a small wooden horse, hand-carved, unfinished, the grain visible like veins. A letter was tucked beneath it. "I'm learning to build things again. The first time it was fences, now it's courage. You were my first kindness, and I will carry it where the road allows." L. Ethan traced the lines of the carving, feeling both ache and peace settle in him at once. He set the horse on the windowsill beside an empty frame where Martha's photo had once been. The frame caught the fading light, and for a moment, he imagined both women there, not competing, not haunting, but existing in quiet acknowledgement of the same man who had finally learned to stay. That night, he lit the fireplace and turned on the old radio. Music filled the house again, soft, deliberate, the kind that asks nothing but to be heard. He sat by the window, tea steaming in his hands, watching the moon rise over the drenched fields. A thought crossed him. How strange it was that love could arrive as a mistake and still leave behind something worth keeping. Li Xinyi had been right. Not everything needed fixing. Some things only needed to be felt, then released. When morning came, he took the letter and the wooden horse out to the barn. He placed them in a small box beside the hayloft, not as relics of loss, but as tokens of what had once been true. Then he saddled his horse and rode toward the ridge, where the land stretched wide and untamed. From there, he could see the world as it was, vast, scarred, and beautiful, the kind of world that could break you open just enough to let light in. He dismounted, standing at the edge of the hill as wind lifted the dust around him. For the first time in years, he spoke aloud, not to Martha, not to the ghosts, but to the air itself. "You were right," he said softly. "You were all." The wind carried his words away, scattering them across the plains. He watched until the horizon blurred and the ache inside him settled into something steady, acceptance, maybe even gratitude. When he turned back toward the ranch, the sun was already high, bleaching the sky clean. The path behind him was empty, but the one ahead seemed endless, and that, he decided, was enough. Ethan Cole rode home with the quiet conviction of a man who no longer feared solitude. Somewhere across an ocean, Li Xinyi would read his last letter, short, honest, written in a hand steadier than before. The land remembers, and so do I. Back on the ranch, the wind moved through the open door, carrying dust, grass, and faint traces of rain. For the first time, it didn't sound like loss. It sounded like life.